In the year 1691, a Portuguese ship captain sailed into a city that shouldn't have existed. He wrote that the streets were so wide and clean that you could see for miles. He saw a palace larger than the city of Haarlem in the Netherlands. But this wasn't London, Paris or Rome. This was Benin City, the heart of the Benin Empire. For centuries, the world has been told that the Great Wall of China is the largest man-made earthwork on the planet. But there is a secret buried in the red earth of West Africa. The Benin Moats were 4 times longer than the Great Wall, a 10,000-mile network of defensive walls and ditches that moved more earth than the Great Pyramids of Cheops. The Fractal City. When modern mathematicians looked at the layout of ancient Benin City, they discovered something shocking. The city wasn't laid out in a grid. It was laid out in fractals. In the West, we think of cities as central hubs and spokes, but the Edo people used a recursive mathematical system. Each house was a miniature version of the street, and each street was a miniature version of the district. This wasn't just for art, it was for efficiency. This mathematical layout allowed for natural cooling, advanced drainage, and a street lighting system that used palm oil lamps. While 17th century London was a dark, muddy maze, Benin City was illuminated and organized. The city was divided into 11 wards, each managed by a guild of specialists. You didn't just live in Benin, you were part of a production machine. There were guilds for wood carvers, ivory hunters, and the most famous of all, the bronze casters. But how do you keep a city of millions running without a modern computer? The answer was the guild system. In Benin, your profession was your identity. If you were born into the Igun Eronwon, you were a bronze caster. If you were born into the Owina, you were a wood carver. These weren't just jobs. They were highly secretive state-sponsored corporations. Think of it like a decentralized factory. The Oba, the king, was the sole client. The guilds didn't sell to the public. They worked for the state. This allowed for incredible quality control. This is why Benin Bronzes looked so consistent over hundreds of years. Every guild had a master of the craft who reported directly to the palace. If you created a masterpiece, you were rewarded with high social status and land. If you failed or leaked the lost wax secret to a foreigner, the punishment was severe. This was a closed-loop economy. The wealth stayed in the city, the secrets stayed in the guilds, and the power stayed with the Oba. When the British first saw Benin City, they thought it was a chaotic sprawl, but they were looking at it through a European lens of grades and right angles. They missed the genius hidden in the geometry. Benin City was a fractal city. What is a fractal? To understand Benin, you have to understand fractals. A fractal is a mathematical set where a small shape repeats itself over and over to create a large, complex structure. Think of a snowflake or a head of a broccoli. In Benin, this wasn't just design, it was an unwritten code of social organization. Each family compound was a small version of the street. Each street was a small version of the district, and each district was a small version of the king's palace. This meant that no matter how much the city grew, it never lost its order. It was scalable architecture centuries before Silicon Valley used the term. The logic of the layout. Why use fractals? Because they solved 2 major problems for a tropical empire: heat and waste. The fractal layout created natural wind tunnels. Because the buildings were clustered in specific mathematical ratios, the air was constantly pulled through the courtyards, creating a natural air conditioning system in the 90-degree heat of West Africa. Furthermore, this layout allowed for a decentralized waste management system. Each fractal unit or district was responsible for its own drainage into the massive moat system we'll talk about later. This is why travelers noted the city was remarkably clean. There was no central pile of trash because the math of the city processed it locally. The street lighting system. But the most shocking feature for a visitor in 1691 was the street lighting. The city was organized into perfectly straight, wide avenues. Along these avenues, the guilds maintained massive iron lamps fueled by palm oil. While people in London were still being mugged in pitch-black alleyways, the citizens of Benin could walk the main thoroughfares at night under artificial light. This wasn't just for safety, it was for commerce. It allowed the markets to stay open after the sun went down, effectively doubling the city's economic output. When you hear about the wealth of the Oba, remember, it was built on an extra 6 hours of daylight that his neighbors didn't have. The bronze economy. To understand Benin's wealth, you have to look at the Benin Bronzes. But don't call them arts. To the Edo people, they were official state records. The Benin Empire didn't use written alphabets in the way we do. Instead, the king commissioned bronze plaques that recorded every law, every victory, and every diplomatic treaty. The technology used, the lost wax process, was more precise than anything European sculptors were doing at the time. They were casting 3D scenes with multiple layers of depth. This industry was fueled by trade. Benin sat at the crossroads of the Atlantic and the Sahel. They traded pepper, ivory, and high-quality cloth for manillas, horseshoe-shaped copper bracelets brought by the Portuguese. They didn't just trade. They controlled the exchange rate. The king held a monopoly on all foreign trade. If you wanted to do business in Benin, you paid in copper and brass, which the empire then melted down to create the records of their power. This was commodity-backed information system. The architecture of the palace. Now let's talk about the palace. 17th century Dutch travelers described the palace of Benin as a city within a city. It wasn't just a house for a king, it was a psychological fortress. The walls were covered in those bronze plaques we mentioned earlier. Imagine walking down a hallway where every inch of the wall is a 3D record of a war your ancestors won. The palace used a series of courtyards, some open to the sky to collect rainwater, others shaded for secret council meetings. The roofs were made of high-quality shingles, and the pillars were wrapped in edged brass. For a visitor from Europe, where cities were often chaotic and cramped, the sheer scale and symmetry of the palace was a message. You are in the presence of an organized mathematical superpower. The high-tech guild and the bronze records. If the city's layout was the software of the empire, the bronze guild was the hardware. In Benin, bronze wasn't just a decoration. It was a data storage device. Since the empire didn't use a written alphabet, these metal plaques were the official archives of the state. Every law, every military victory, and every royal decree was cast in bronze and bolted to the pillars of the palace. The secrets of the lost wax process. Even today, with all our modern technology, this process is incredibly difficult to master. First, a master sculptor would carve a perfect 3D model out of beeswax, down to the tiny braids in a soldier's hair or the scales on a leopard's skin. Then, they would cover the wax in fine clay. When the clay was fired in a kiln, the wax would melt and run out, leaving a hollow perfect negative space. Finally, they would pour molten bronze, a mixture of copper and tin heated to over 1000 degrees Celsius, into that narrow gap. If the temperature was off by even a few degrees, or if there was a tiny air bubble, the entire masterpiece would shatter. The craftsmen of Benin were doing this with near zero failure rates for centuries. The metallurgy of power. Where did the metal come from? This is where the international finance angle comes in. Benin was the ultimate trade negotiator. When the Portuguese arrived, they realized the king did not want their trinkets or their beads. He wanted copper. The Portuguese brought manillas, horseshoe-shaped copper bracelets. The king's treasury would collect these by the thousands, effectively acting as a national metal reserve. They would then melt these foreign currencies down and rebrand them into Benin Bronzes. This was a genius move. By turning foreign currency into local state art, they ensured that the wealth of the empire was physically attached to the walls of the palace. You couldn't just steal the money without dismantling the history of the nation. The record keepers of Igun Eronwon. The casters belonged to the Igun Eronwon Guild. They lived in their own district and were forbidden from leaving the city without the king's permission. Why the secrecy? Because the bronze was the source code of the empire. If a rival kingdom learned how to cast bronze this perfectly, they could forge the king's records or create their own propaganda. The guilds were the keepers of the truth. When you look at a Benin bronze today, you are not just looking at art. You are looking at a high-fidelity historical document that has survived 500 years of tropical humidity, something paper could never do. The 10,000-mile wall. Now let's talk about the ear, the Great Moats. Imagine 600 years of continuous construction. The Benin Moats weren't just dug for defense. They were a geographical information system. They delineated borders, managed water runoff from tropical storms, and served as a massive census tool. If you lived inside the walls, you were a citizen of the empire. If you lived outside, you were a trade partner. It is estimated that it took 150 million man-hours to complete this project. For perspective, the Great Pyramid of Giza took about 20 million man-hours. The scale of the Benin Moats is almost beyond human comprehension for a pre-industrial society. It suggests a level of civil engineering and labor management that we are only just beginning to understand in 2026. The ear, the world's greatest earthwork. Now, we have to look at the scale. If you took all the earth moved to build the Benin Moats and stacked it in a wall 1 meter high and 1 meter thick, the wall would wrap around the entire planet twice. This was the ear, a network of defensive walls and ditches that stretched for an estimated 16,000 kilometers through the dense rainforest of West Africa. The engineering feat. How do you build something this massive in a tropical jungle without modern machinery? You do it in mass logistics. The construction was not done all at once. It was a continuous project that lasted for 600 years. The empire used a system of seasonal labor. During the dry season, when farming was quiet, the king would mobilize thousands of citizens. This was not slave labor in the way we often think of it. It was a national service. In exchange for their labor, the citizens were given protection, food from the state's silos, and a share of the empire's trade wealth. Their design was ingenious. They didn't just dig a hole. They used a cut and fill method. They dug a deep ditch and used the exact soil to fill a higher bank on the inner side. This created a double obstacle. An attacker would have to climb down into a steep trench and then immediately scale up a 20-foot wall of slippery red clay, while soldiers shot arrows from the top. The living border. The ear wasn't just a wall. It was a geographical information system. The network was divided into inner and outer rings. The inner walls. These protected the urban core, the palace, and the secret groves. The outer wall. These were more than just defense. They were property markers. Each wall delineated the territory of a specific village or guild. If you wanted to enter the city, you had to pass through specific gates guarded by the Oni Eya, the guardians of the wall. They didn't just check for weapons. They collected custom duties. This was how the empire tracked its population and its imports. It was a physical manifestation of the empire's tax code. The tropical durability. Think about the environment. West Africa has some of the heaviest rainfall on Earth. A normal wall of death would wash away in a single season. The Edo engineers understood soil science. They used the natural high iron content of the red laterite soil, which when packed tightly and exposed to the sun, becomes almost as hard as concrete. They also planted specific vegetation on the banks to prevent erosion. The wall was a living structure that actually got stronger over time as the roots of the jungle anchored the earth together. The 1897 raid. In 1897, a British punitive expedition invaded the city. They were shocked by what they found. The British officers couldn't believe that Africans had created the bronzes they saw. They stole thousands of artifacts and burned the city to the ground. Today, those bronzes are in the British Museum and the Humboldt Forum. They are the stolen history of an empire that was centuries ahead of its time. As we look at the ruins today, we see more than just broken walls. We see a blueprint for how a civilization can thrive through mathematics, organization, and a deep respect for its own history. For over 800 years, the walls of Benin held. The empire had survived civil wars, internal coups, and the rise and fall of neighboring states. But in 1897, the industrial might of the British Empire arrived at its gates. The Punitive Expedition. The British claimed the invasion was a response to an attack on a trade mission, but the speed and scale of their response suggests a deeper motive. When the British forces entered Benin City, they did not just find a military target. They found a museum. The soldiers were stunned. They found thousands of bronze plaques, ivory tusks, and coral-beaded regalia. These were the state records we talked about earlier. To the British, these were curiosities and booty. To the Edo people, this was their library. By stealing the bronzes, the British weren't just taking metal. They were deleting the written history of a nation. The Great Fire. After looting the palace, the British did something unforgivable. They set the city on fire. Because the city was built on that brilliant fractal system using timber and red clay, the fire spread with terrifying speed. The Great Palace, the center of West African engineering, was reduced to ashes. The 10,000-mile walls were left to be swallowed by the jungle. The British justified this by calling Benin the City of Blood, painting the Edo as savages to hide the fact that they had just destroyed one of the most organized urban centers on earth. The diaspora of art. Today, the soul of the Benin Empire is scattered across the globe. There are more Benin Bronzes in London and Berlin than there are in Benin City. In 2026, the battle for the return of these artifacts, restitution, is one of the biggest legal stories in the world. Germany has begun returning pieces. The Smithsonian has returned pieces, but the British Museum remains a holdout. The question we must ask is this: if a city burned, its walls leveled, and its records stolen, does the civilization ever truly die, or does it live on in red clay, waiting for us to tell its story? As we look at the ruins of Air today, we see more than just death. We see the logic of a people who mastered mathematics and metal long before the world gave them credit. If you believe these artifacts belong back in the hands of the people who created them, let me know in the comments.